Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another mini episode of How Brands Are Built. I'm your host, Rob Meyerson. This is the second mini episode I've done. It's something new I've added to the podcast feed, short episodes on a range of topics with no consistent theme or through line, just some interesting snack-sized branding content. Today's episode features Brad Flowers, founding partner of Bullhorn, a marketing company in Lexington, Kentucky. Brad is also the author of a new book titled The Naming Book, 5 Steps to Creating Brand and Product Names That Sell. Regular listeners know that naming is an area of focus for me, so when I heard about Brad's book, I couldn't wait to read it and ask him a few questions. A quick note before we start. This was recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic. You might hear Brad's dog barking or other background noise. We're both working from home and doing our best during these strange times, as I'm sure you are. With that, here's Brad Flowers on How Brands Are Built. Brad Flowers, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So as you know, we talked about this a little bit in advance of the show here today. There aren't a whole lot of books about brand naming. So what made you decide that you wanted to write one, and why now, and what's kind of unique about yours?
Sure. So I'm kind of a self-taught namer. Mm-hmm. We were hired to do it early on. I started Bullhorn in 2008. And like a lot of companies like ours, when you first start, you kind of take any business that you can get and then over time narrow. Well, while we were still taking any business we could get, we took a naming project, and it was great fun. I have a background in English literature, so I really enjoyed it. But as we kind of grew and the team grew, I had a hard time other than basing things on intuition. I couldn't really provide a process for people to help or places for people to slot in. Right. And so I did what anyone would do probably. I started reading all of the books about naming, and I realized that most of the books out there about naming fit into 2 general categories. There are books that are telling stories about how names were created or what they mean or something like that, which is pretty interesting, but not necessarily helpful if you have to create a name.
Right.
And then the other category is they tend to be people who are good at naming, and it's what their preferences are. And they kind of outline like why they think certain names are good and why other names aren't good, which is also interesting and helpful. But I couldn't really find a really solid process at the time. And so I didn't really set out to create a book. I set out to create something for my coworkers. And then I kind of realized over time that there was this gap in the market. And then the more I thought about it, as I was thinking about entrepreneurs, there are these people who have, these great ideas that could change the world, and they come to market with a really lousy name. And so I thought, if I can't figure out how to do this in a kind of systematic way, they certainly can't.
Yeah, it seems like you definitely developed a system. In fact, there are 5 steps. And one of the things I really like about the book is how prescriptive it is. I mean, I'm sure, I would guess that you would tell readers that they can maybe bend the rules or something a little bit if they find that it works better for them. But you've also given them a really clear and well kind of prescribed structure that they can stick to if they want to. So how did you come up with the 5 steps that you have in there? And if you wouldn't mind just kind of rattling them off for listeners, what are those 5 steps?
Sure. So as I was thinking about it, I kind of realized there were 2 hard things about naming. The first is that it's hard to know what makes a good name. Mm-hmm. And so the first step is about building your criteria. And I think this is the step that most people, entrepreneurs especially, skip over, and they skip straight to trying to find the good name, not thinking about, well, what does the name actually need to do? So the first step is building the criteria. The next 3 are all about how to generate lots of names. So I think the second hard thing about naming is it is hard to have a wide range of ideas.
Right.
Most of our education is based around this kind of convergent idea that you need to come to one answer, where really naming isn't like that. It's kind of a divergent exercise.
Yeah, the more the merrier, at least at first, right?
Yeah, you need lots of ideas to weigh against your criteria. And so I have 3 full steps dedicated to how do you brainstorm, which again, I think a lot of people have a hard time with that blank page. Mm-hmm. How do you actually compile names based on your brainstorming lists? And I break out a wide range of types of names for people to kind of start slotting and building so that when they do start to decide, they actually have different ideas. I think a lot of times people end up with different versions of the same idea.
Right.
So hopefully we can actually have different ideas to talk about. And then the fourth step rather is expanding your knowledge. So how do you use research? How do you use the internet to find obscure words, interesting words, things that might be useful when building out your list? And then the final step is how to decide.
Right, which is also, I think, one of the hardest choices, especially when you have built out that long list.
Oh, it's so hard. Yeah, we try to have around 200 words or so coming into the decision stage at Bullhorn, and it's like it gets down to 30. Usually we can get it down to 30 fairly easily. Right. But then from there, it's pretty tough.
Yeah. And what a lot of people don't realize is that as hard as it is to pick one name on your own, the second if you're not a solo entrepreneur, if you're in a 10-person company and you're trying to get everybody to agree, the chances that everybody thinks the same name works well are almost zero unless you've got some pretty clear-cut objective criteria set out from the beginning.
That's exactly right. And then it's like people will oftentimes forget the criteria or
right. They just knee-jerk go to whichever they like or don't like.
Exactly.
So the first, you have this sort of series of worksheets in the book. And the first one asks readers to just take 3 brand names. They can choose, I guess, any ones they want and kind of post-rationalize each name. So sure, you say you like Apple, but without necessarily knowing what the story is behind that name, just come up with your own story. Right. I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of get people warmed up to the idea of naming. How did you come up with that? And, why'd you decide to start there?
I think jumping into brainstorming lists first is a little boring. And I kind of, most people, unless you think about naming all of the time, take the brand names that surround you totally for granted. I think most people, while we really sweat a lot about the specific names, most people just don't care at all. Right, just don't know or care. It's just like, does this product suit my needs, or does it not? And so I think just taking a step back and thinking a little bit that someone might actually think about what a name means is an important first step for someone who doesn't do it often. Yeah. So, when you look around and in the first probably 10 minutes of your day, you probably come across 100 brand names that you don't even recognize or think about. And so this just gives someone the opportunity to take a step back and start to just recognize the names that exist and how they're working, so that when you start to think about your name, you can understand that, while Apple seems like a great name, on day one, it felt like a really risky and probably a pretty dumb name, really.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you're right that people don't really acknowledge brand names unless they think it's a real stinker, kind of, people are easy to jump to, oh, that brand name sucks. But all these names that they either think are good or just okay, they kind of ignore. And eventually we get so used to things like Google, whereas the first time you heard Google, I remember the first time I heard it, it sounded ridiculous. And of course I had no idea that it was going to kill all the other search engines and become the behemoth that it is. Now when people hear it, they don't think twice, and it's become this verb. So I just think opening people's minds to the fact that the brain is a very flexible thing is a great way to get them into the right frame of mind.
Yeah, and in the criteria list, I talk a little bit about meaning, and I think some names like Google and Apple, they go from having kind of a literal meaning at the foundation, and then over time they just really become symbols for the experiences that you have with the products, and you don't even really think about the name anymore. You just think about what they do. Right. And so that's another thing to consider, when you're thinking of your name as a criteria point. Do you want something more like Skype, which is pretty empty, or do you want something like Apple, which is, brings stuff along with it in the trunk, so to speak? Right.
One thing that's interesting, and I really want to touch on, because this is, in a lot of ways, the process that you've outlined mirrors the type of process that I would take or recommend that clients take. But a couple of things diverge a little bit. One of them is you really encourage your readers to explore every type of name. There are, coined words, real words, descriptive names, and so on. And a lot of times, in my experience, we ask clients to try to narrow it down on the front end. So, what types of names do you think you want? And, sometimes that's easy because we're trying to match some kind of naming strategy that the company has been using consistently for years. And so we know we're not going to look at even explore certain types of names. But I think it's really interesting in this case where, let's say it's an entrepreneur just naming their company, to kind of force them to explore every type of name. So even if their gut reaction is, oh, I hate all those made up words, I like that you're kind of saying, well, hold on a second. Let's just see if there are any that might kind of change your mind on that and have them explore everything. Was that done? I mean, is that kind of purposefully done and something that you encourage with your clients to have them keep an open mind?
Well, not always. I think depending on what, like you mentioned, sometimes if you're naming a product or service, you don't really need to do all of the different types of names. It's going to fall within a certain system, and it has to make sense within the brand architecture that's been laid out.
Right.
So products and services are a little bit different there. And then also, depending on if it's for an organization or, like, for example, recently we were hired to name a development, and for within
like a real estate development.
Exactly. Yeah. So for a real estate development, being kind of contextualized in a neighborhood, some foreign language words probably just don't make sense, or like made up words seem a little strange. Yeah. Because they feel like it doesn't fit in that market.
Right.
We cut it down depending on the project, but I do think if it's someone starting from the beginning, if it's a new company, I would really encourage them to pursue all the different types, because, frankly, you can be really surprised. And it happens almost every single project. I'll go into it and I'll be thinking, oh, it has to be probably this type of name. And then sometimes it's me, or sometimes it's someone else, one of the other writers that at Bullhorn comes up with an idea that's perfect and it's totally surprising. Mm-hmm. And that's when it's like really, I think it's exciting and fun. And so I would definitely encourage people to pursue as wide a range as possible, because you can surprise yourself.
Yeah, I find that even when we have a really sort of tight naming brief at the front end of a project, sometimes it pays off to go off brief and show a client, I know you said you wanted this, but let us just show you a couple of ideas that are not technically on brief, at risk of upsetting the client that you've gone off brief. But a lot of times, like you said, those surprising ideas either are the answer or can help you get to something that's maybe a little more interesting than where the brief would have taken you had you stuck to it, to the letter of it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think often the client will appreciate it's like, look, we followed the brief. We have some ideas here, but we have these other ideas too we'd like you to consider. I mean, I think the fact that you are thinking about it, working at it, putting in the time, mm-hmm. I think the thoughtfulness is appreciated,
right?
Even if the brief is pretty tight. So.
Yeah. There, towards the end of the book, so I guess it's pretty much all in step 5. I thought you had some really good advice for people around, I think, parts of the naming process that maybe people don't even think about when they get started. So, everyone knows you have to come up with a bunch of name ideas, and that's why you've allotted so much of the book to that process. But then after you've got them, there's the process of narrowing it down, the process of maybe asking people for advice, whether you do some kind of more formal naming research or you're just kind of doing an informal focus group of friends or colleagues. There's launching the name, which is a whole thing unto itself. So any bits of advice toward the end of the book that you found are, I don't know, especially useful with clients or that people that have read the book early, sort of what's resonating with people?
Yeah, I think the part that you have to kind of handle the most carefully is inevitably you'll go through and you'll have a few names that you really like and you'll want to show people. Mm-hmm. And that's like the most perilous part of the journey. Right.
The whole thing can go up in flames at that moment.
Oh man. The wheels will fall off. So you'll show someone and they're like, yeah, don't get it. Mm-hmm. And that's like the least helpful thing that anyone could ever say. But it's a really hard question to ask somebody. It's like, would this be a good name for a company? And it's like, well, what does the company do? What's your strategy? You have to tell such a backstory.
Right.
That to get someone up to speed is pretty hard unless they've gone through the whole process. But I do think getting initial reactions can be useful. And so what we do at Bullhorn, one of the things we do is when we come down to a short list of, say, 20 or 30 names, I'll put them into a presentation, and people are really sensitive to imagery and typography. Mm-hmm. And so I'll usually put each name over a couple of different images and with a couple of different typefaces, just to give a sense of what it might feel like in all caps or what it might feel like in a serif typeface or something. Mm-hmm. And so then we'll go through and I'll have people rate it, 1 to 10, like this is the worst name ever. I think this is a great name. And also any kind of like initial reaction. And so it's nice to get the reaction of people who, number one, aren't as close to the project, and two, maybe have a different vocabulary than you do.
Right.
And so, you get a sense of like, well, maybe if you think about names a lot, you probably have a larger vocabulary than the average person. And so you're making some assumptions about what people will know. And so it's helpful to get some initial feedback on, no one could ever pronounce this word, or no one could ever spell it, or I've never heard of this. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
So, and it doesn't necessarily kill the name for me, but it is good to know what barriers might exist out there for the average person.
I want to clarify one thing just for listeners. When you said that you'll put the names over different imagery and different fonts and things like that, mm-hmm. do you then do the same thing for each name to avoid any kind of bias? So, if one name is in a serif font and one's in a sans serif, that could obviously shift people's perceptions. So did I understand that correctly, that you sort of choose what you're going to do and then you do the same thing for each name idea?
That's right. Yep. Okay. I'll pick usually 2 images that somehow loosely relate to the business or product or service.
Right.
And I try to pick kind of like different things. So like, for example, for this development, one image was an image of an old building that had obviously been refurbished. The other image was a group of people at a party. And so it was like, those are 2 images that you could imagine relating to the final thing, but they're pretty different. And then on one image, I used a sans serif, and on the other image, I used a serif. And I try to be consistent throughout the presentation, so that to try to eliminate bias. I want people to see possibility, but not be biased.
Right.
Then when it comes time to show the client, sometimes we will try to lead them in certain directions, and so we'll put something in a certain typeface because we think it works better. Right. But that's a whole nother story.
And then I want to come back to this great point you made about people having different vocabulary. I think even beyond just, how big of a vocabulary somebody has, there's then obviously people with different language backgrounds, right? So even if they're English speakers, maybe they speak other languages. And so there's some kind of classic mistakes that some brands have fallen into, not recognizing, this word means something else in another language. But I found, even for native English speakers, I've had British people look at names, and I didn't realize that the word was sort of slang in England and meant something. Yeah, that's why we always call it linguistic and cultural. We call them disaster checks, because it's not just about what language do you speak, but people speaking English or Spanish in LA versus New York could have very different perspectives.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I have one last question for you, and I'm going to try to get you to tell at least a little bit of a story that you kind of used to wrap up the book that I just loved so much. So you mentioned that you hate this question that all namers, I think, hate, which is just, what's your favorite brand name? Because there's so many different ways to answer that, and it really depends on context. But then you do have a great story about one name that you love, and it's one that your son came up with. I think he's 5 or 6.
At the time, yeah.
Yeah. So can you just tell a little of that story, what the name is, and why you like it so much?
Yeah, sure. I try to go to extremes through the book to say that, like, my preferences really don't matter, that the name should work for you. It should meet your criteria. But inevitably, people want to know. So at the end, I talk about my son. He was at school. He had recently learned about refugees, and we had done a project with a refugee resettlement agency here in town, and he wanted to do something to help. And at the time, he was really into making these little bracelets. And so he decided he was going to make bracelets at this market that is a holiday market, and we were going to sell it and donate the proceeds. And so eventually my whole family is sitting around making bracelets before dinner, after dinner, first thing in the morning.
Wow.
It got a little
All
out
hands
of
on
control.
deck.
It was all hands on deck. And I wasn't necessarily a great bracelet maker, I'm going to be honest. But I thought, like, okay, so when it comes time to what we're going to call it, this is really where I can come in. You know, we're going to have
where I shine.
we're going to have a fantastic name.
Yep.
And so I was like, okay, George, we need to make a sign and we need a name. And I'm going to help you come up with a name. And he's like, I already have a name. I was like, how do you already have a name? And he's like, yeah, we're going to call it George's Jewels. And I was like, oh man, yeah, there's no way I could do better than that. I mean, George's Jewels, it's like, it's what it is. There are these little bracelets, even though it was funny on that front too, because they're like these little plastic trinket things.
Right. Not exactly.
They're not
jewels.
really jewels.
But to a 5-year-old.
But the items, they were kind of jewelry. And then just like all of the connotations with George's Jewels.
Some unbeknownst to him.
Yeah, he didn't know at all.
Yeah.
And so like I thought it made a great name because it caught people's attention. You know, as they were going by and they saw this sign, they stopped and laughed.
Yeah.
They looked at it and then he got to tell the story.
Yeah.
And he sold like $250 worth of these little things that
Good
he was
for
able
George.
to give to the Refugee Resettlement Agency. So
that is great. It's amazing. It's a great story. I love the name's got alliteration. It's got everything.
It's genuinely good. So, you know, maybe he'll be my successor. I don't know.
Or maybe you can just have him help you brainstorm on the next project.
Why wait? He's obviously already good at it.
Awesome. Well, Brad, thank you so much for making time to chat. Congratulations on the book. I'm going to add it to a list of books about naming that I keep on the site. And I wish you all the best. And hopefully we can chat again sometime soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this mini episode of How Brands Are Built. To learn more about The Naming Book, go to thenamingbook.com. It's available now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and indiebound.org. To learn more about Brad and Bullhorn, visit bullhorncreative.com or find them on social media. If you like this episode, please let me know. Leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. While you're there, you can subscribe to hear more of these mini episodes as well as the next season. And of course, you can also listen on Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you cast your pods. You can also follow along on social media and visit the site at howbrandsarebuilt.com for show notes, blog posts, the newsletter sign up, and more. How Brands Are Built is a production of Heirloom Agency, LLC. Our logo and original podcast artwork is by Joel Sherlow, with additional design work by Lacey Honda. Web development by Matias Garrido. Our theme music is by Isha Erskine Project. Thanks again for tuning in to this mini episode. I'm Rob Meyerson, and I'll talk to you next time.